There is an image of Otto von Bismarck that most people carry in their head, an iron-faced man in a military uniform, cold, calculating and ruthless, a man who said might makes right and built an empire on blood and conquest, a man who manipulated Europe like a chessboard, who started wars with casual precision, who unified Germany through sheer force of will and cunning, the Iron Chancellor. But when you actually read his letters, when you look at what he actually said and did, a very different picture emerges. A man who was actually anxious about what he was doing, a man who doubted himself constantly, a man whose greatest strength was not ruthlessness but understanding how systems worked and using them. His name was Otto Eduard Leopold von Bismarck Schönhausen, and in my view, he's one of the most misunderstood figures in European history. Not because he was innocent, he wasn't, but because the myth we build around him obscures who he actually was. Bismarck was born in 1815 in a Prussian estate to a Junker family, the old Prussian aristocracy. He was not destined for power, he was not groomed as a statesman from birth. He went to university, studied law, wandered around for years, uncertain what he wanted to do with his life. He was moody. He suffered from what we might now call depression. He wrote letters expressing doubt about his abilities, frustration with himself, uncertainty about his direction. This was not the stuff legends are made of, but he was observant. He watched how things work. He studied people. He paid attention to systems and incentives in a way most politicians simply didn't. By his 40s, through a combination of family connections and his own obvious intelligence, he was brought into the service to the Prussian crown. He became ambassador, then eventually minister president. By then, something had changed in him, or perhaps something had just been waiting for the right role. The myth says Bismarck unified Germany through aggressive warfare and iron will. The reality is more complicated. When Bismarck took power in 1862, German unification wasn't his idea. It was already the dream of German liberates and nationalists across the German state. The idea that all German speaking people should be unified under one government was already floating in the air. What Bismarck did was see that this dream could be used to solve Prussia's immediate problem, its relationship with Austria. In my view, this is the key to understanding Bismarck. He wasn't a visionary dreamer, he was a tactician who took existing dreams and channeled them toward Prussia's interests. He famously said that the great question of today would not be settled by speeches and majority votes, but by blood and iron. Historians quote this as proof of his ruthlessness, but reading context, he was simply stating what he thought was true, that idealism wouldn't solve the problems, force would have to play a role, and he wasn't wrong. Bismarck engineered three wars against Denmark, against Austria, and against France. Each war expanded Prussian power, each war moved Germany closer to unification. But here's what I found interesting when I read deeper. None of these were inevitable. None of them were Bismarck's first choice. He preferred diplomacy, he preferred deals, he preferred using the system. The Danish War happened because Denmark threatened to absorb German-speaking Holstein. War seemed like the only solution. The Austrian War happened because Austria was in Bismarck's way. Prussia and Austria both wanted to lead a unified Germany, and they couldn't both win. War became necessary. The French War happened because, well, this one is more complicated. Bismarck didn't want war with France, but he orchestrated a situation where France would look aggressive if it objected to German unification. And when France objected, he had his excuse. Was this ruthless? Absolutely. Was it brilliant? Yes. Was it inevitable? Less clear. What's often missing from the Bismarck myth is how much he was reacting to circumstances he didn't entirely control, and how much he was using existing systems rather than creating entirely new ones. The other missing piece is how much doubt Bismarck carried with him. His letters are filled with it. After major victories, he would write expressing exhaustion, questioning whether it had all been worth it, wondering if it made terrible mistakes. After the French War, for example, after German unification was complete, after he'd achieved what most politicians only dream of, he was tired and anxious. He wrote, I have often had the misfortune to take a different view from that of my superiors, and have always borne the consequences without complaint. This wasn't the voice of an all powerful dictator, this was the voice of a man who was constantly uncertain if he was doing the right thing, who was aware that he might be wrong, who was aware that powerful people might turn against him. He was right to be anxious, because eventually they did. In 1890, after 28 years of dominance, after building the German Empire, after reshaping Europe, Bismarck was fired. The new Kaiser, Wilhelm II, Wilhelm II, wanted to rule alone. Bismarck's style of governing, his manipulation, his backroom dealing, his absolute certainty that he knew best, had become a liability. Wilhelm II basically said, "You're done. Go home." And Bismarck went home to his estate and spent his final years writing his memoirs, his letters, essentially arguing with history about who he had been and what he had done. He died in 1898, effectively broken by the loss of power. And here's what I find most tragic. He had spent his entire career building a system that was so dependent on him that when he was removed from it, the system began to show some cracks. The Kaiser used Bismarck methods without Bismarck's restraint. Within a generation, the German Empire had plunged the continent into World War I. Bismarck apparently saw this coming. In his final years, he supposedly said something like, 20 years after I'm dead, the crash will come. He was almost exactly right. What strikes me most about Bismarck is that the myth actually diminishes him. The Iron Chancellor is simple. He's easy to understand. He wanted power, he took it. He used it ruthlessly. The real Bismarck is much more interesting. He was a man who understood systems so deeply that he could bend them without breaking them. A man who doubted himself constantly but acted anyway. A man who achieved something extraordinary and then had it taken away from him by someone who admired him but didn't understand him. The real Bismarck is also sadder, because he succeeded in unifying Germany and then watched as the Germans squandered that unity into the worst war in European history. He built something that was supposed to bring peace and order to Europe, and instead it brought catastrophe. And I think that's the real tragedy of Bismarck. Not that he was ruthless, but that he was right about how power works, and then proved right in the worst possible way when his successors used the same understanding to destroy everything. Bismarck believed that nations operated according to self-interest and power, not ideals. He built a system based on that belief, and it worked until it didn't. Do you think he was right about human nature? And if he was, can any system built on that foundation last? Let me know in the comments. Otto von Bismarck unified Germany and reshaped Europe. He was ruthless, calculating, and brilliant, but he was also anxious, doubtful, and actually aware that he might be wrong. The myth we tell about him is of an iron-willed dictator who knew exactly what he was doing and did it without hesitation. The reality is of a man who understood systems better than anyone of his time, who bent those systems towards his vision, but who never quite believed in himself, and who watched as everything he built was dismantled by someone who admired him but lacked his restraint. The Iron Chancellor is a simpler story, but the real Bismarck is the more important one to understand, because he shows us that even the most powerful men can be trapped by systems they've created, and that understanding how power works doesn't guarantee you can control where it goes.